These are the outer bands of the hurricane, but this is not the hurricane. The hurricane's coming in about 4 to 6 years.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Taylor Bradley. We just returned from the 4th of July holiday, but we did publish a mini episode during that time that I would encourage you to go back and have a listen to. Though today, we have something else special in store for you. We're taking a deep dive into the fascinating world of labor economics and its direct impact on HR and compensation strategies. Our panelists of experts will take us from a bird's eye view down to the granular throughout the episode today. First, we'll be joined by Ron Hetrick, Vice President of Staffing Strategy and Senior Labor Economist at LightCast. Ron has been a labor economist for over 30 years and will help us better understand the big picture of demographic shifts, immigration patterns, and how these trends are reshaping our workforce. Then we're going to narrow our focus just a little bit with Erica White, Executive Director of HR Search and Recruitment at Fraser Jones. Erica will give us the inside scoop on what's happening in the HR job market right now, specifically at that executive placement level. And finally, we're going to zoom into that granular level as we speak with a Forbes 30 Under 30 CEO and founder, Rani Mavram from Complete. She is an expert in all things compensation strategy and will help us better understand how companies are adapting their pay practices in this dynamic environment. So buckle up as we navigate from the bird's eye view of labor economics all the way down to the nitty-gritty of compensation. Let's get started with our first guest, Ron Hetrick.
If you could give our listeners some insight into what is a labor economist and what do they do?
As a labor economist, I have literally spent 30 years doing nothing but studying labor markets, labor market data. There is actually an odd group of us who focus only on the labor side. So where's labor at? How's it flowing from place to place? What are the factors affecting it? We also look a lot at the macroeconomy because it seems like everything affects labor at the end of the day.
There's also some subspecialties within labor economics. Is there a particular area that you've either specialized in or that you just love to learn more about?
I love to look at specific industries, but really just that overall macro view of how things are flowing. Recently, that changed for me. So a couple of years ago, I was lead author of Demographic Drought. And now I have really become infatuated with the demographic changes that we're going through as a labor force. As a result of that, I've now completely immersed myself into immigration, which is really the only way we're growing our labor force right now. So all of those things have become, I would almost say they're like specialties. They're different flavors of labor economics.
Let's get into those two topics, which have definitely been top of mind for me. I recently was at a summit with the CEO and CHRO of AARP, and they talked about the structural shift that's occurring in the marketplace today. 10,000 baby boomers a day retiring, and Gen Z, millennials are the largest percentage of the workforce at the moment. From your perspective at the macro level, what other structural trends are you seeing?
We're rewriting Demographic Drought right now. And one of the most fascinating aspects of this is that if you go back to 2020 to now, only 15% of our labor force growth has come from non-Hispanic Americans. So we know, especially in the past year, foreign-born workers have accounted for pretty much 100% of our labor force growth. So it's not that you're not bringing people into the labor force, domestic workers into the labor force. It's just that we're losing as many, if not more of them on any given month. So this is the factor. We're literally changing dramatically right now. These things were in place. We knew this was going to happen, but I think everything was accelerated so much. We had about 3 million excess retirements that occurred during the pandemic. And if you look at people who say, I'm not in the labor force, that's 5 million higher now than it was prior to the pandemic. Over 80% of that 5 million are people 55 and over. They're not coming back. The labor force participation rate for these people went down. It never recovered. We do not expect it to recover anymore. I think blowing up that myth that boomers love to work and they were going to work forever is an important thing for everybody to grasp, because They're not coming back to save us. And I don't think that would be necessarily a good idea anyway, because I think it's a Band-Aid keeping us from coming up with better solutions going forward.
And is that what's contributing to job seeker ratio remaining at around 0.8? And maybe elaborate a bit more for our listeners who are familiar with those metrics.
They come out with it every week, and that is unemployment claims. So let's really focus in on that number. Now, you have to think about the fact that since 1970, the U.S. population has grown well over 100 million. We are massively bigger than we were. However, the amount of people on unemployment is about equal to where we were in 1970. So that gives you an understanding of there are a very tiny percentage of people that are this actively seeking person looking for a job to a point where they would be able to collect unemployment, which means probably 3 interviews a month. They've tightened up on those things, but that's what we want to do because we want to show if people are actively searching. A lot of people right now, they look at the job openings number, which is just about north of 8 million, and they go, well, I don't know if I believe it. And the problem with that is that if your personal experience sometimes isn't justified by a number, you go, well, I don't believe it. And I think what's happened is there's a lot of softening occurring like in the professional sectors, but that doesn't mean that there's not this unbelievable demand for workers in mom and pop shops. A lot of the job postings are coming in places that employ 10 people or less. If you think about things like LinkedIn, they're filled with professionals who are trying to sell business to business services. But you can't sell business to business services to people who only have mom and pop shops. So their feeling is, well, then the economy stinks, or no, the job market's not good. And I don't believe these job openings numbers. It's just the kind of jobs we're creating right now are not the jobs people wish we were creating. 8 out of the top 10 most in need jobs, as far as job postings last month, did not require a college degree of any kind.
Before we get into the topic of immigration, because that's actually an interesting segue, is the JOLTS tracked sectors for hiring are still net positive. But to your point, there are some sectors that are still in the throes of not having enough talent and others that may be easing off hiring.
Just 2 months ago, restaurants got back to the employment level that they had prior to the pandemic. Now, we have 8 million more people in this economy, so you can't tell me the demand for restaurants is lower. It just took them that long to get back to where they were. That is an industry with almost 1 million job openings. You have a lot of retail places with help wanted signs drive along the highways. You have manufacturing companies who have help wanted signs along highways. Construction companies constantly looking for skilled trades workers.
It's fascinating just hearing what you say, not seeing so many per hour wage rates being posted all over town. Here's what we're offering. And then the unique benefits that go along with it. Is that where we're seeing wage growth? Is that bottom quartile of wage earners?
For 21 and 22, a tremendous amount of our wage growth occurred in those particular sectors. Now, it gets interesting. Last year, in 2023, we saw about 3.3 million immigrants come in. About 2.5 million entered the labor force. About 1.8, 1.6 million of those may not have been necessarily legal. Now, this is an important statement. We know that this data is real. We know that these things can be observed. But what we can also see is when the immigration numbers came up, we started to finally see wage inflation starting to get under control. Now, there's people out there who would be like, well, that's terrible. Well, the answer is no, it's not, because all of the wage inflation we experienced in 21 and 22 was immediately passed on to consumers. We saw people complaining about the price of eggs or how much even going to a fast food restaurant, what it used to cost them. In order to get that under control, we really needed a bigger supply of workers from a non-college degree level to take these jobs. And that's what we got. And so I think the wage growth we're seeing now is actually pretty mild. And it's almost kind of scattershot. That intense competition is going away. Employers are starting to get used to this. When you can't hire, you can do one of two things. You accept less business or you provide less service. And I think we're getting to a point where we as a society are starting to accept those things. I've heard numerous companies say, we turn down orders now. Our construction firms going, look, we just can't. We don't have a backlog. We can't even put you on the backlog. We wouldn't even get you for 2 years. And then from the service side, restaurants, a particular waiter or waitress probably has a bigger section. You're not seeing them as much. Everybody needs to understand. Don't complain about how long it takes to get your food. There's probably less people there. So I think people are starting to adapt to that, and that eases the wage pressure as well, because you can pay the couple workers that you have more, retain them, and then just deal with the fact that you can't provide as much service as or business as you did before.
In that particular segment of the economy, in a downturn, do we see their wages come down faster than, let's say, more top quartile of where?
Historically speaking, the answer was always yes. I do not believe that will ever happen again. And the reason being is that the demand that we see going forward is so going to outpace the supply. And here's the way you need to look at it. We talk about retirees. So if you think about a retiree, this is a person who was a producer and a consumer, okay? When you retire, you go from being a producer consumer to a pure consumer. So when we talk about people retiring 10,000 a day, and I think the projection was 4 million retirees this year, that's 4 million people who went from producing and consuming to just consuming. And we already know that we are not adding the number of people at the younger ages to make up for these people that are purely looking at our demographic drought article. We're rewriting it. We're changing the theme to be like a hurricane. These are the outer bands of the hurricane, but this is not the hurricane. The hurricane's coming in about 4 to 6 years, probably about 4 years. Boomers right now are 60 to 78 years old. The average age of retirement is 61. So we believe that in about 4 years, pretty much all of that boomer population will have turned into consumers. And that is when we also go off the cliff at the bottom end, because the 2008 babies turned 16 this year. That was our last decent year of children. It still wasn't replacement rate level, but it was the last decent amount we had. These were the people right before the housing bust. Our houses were going up in value when we were making babies, but then the market bust. And now we stopped. And we really took a sharp nosedive in after that. So all of this math starts to occur. In 4 years, you start to look at it and go, wow, we are going to be at the point we're going to need more producers than ever. We're going to have less than we've ever seen.
And so to offset that, it seems that there's two plausible options. There's either technology boost in productivity and or immigration.
That's right.
What are your views on both of those?
Yeah, I went from knowing nothing about immigration 2 years ago to somehow becoming an advocate at a big level. As a labor market economist, you start to look at things and you go, how is work going to get done? The way we phrase it now is work can get done in 3 ways. You can push it out to the world. So you can globalize like we did for decades, push it to India, push your manufacturing to China or Malaysia. You can bring the world to you through immigration, or you can get workers locally. And we look at this and we think there's still this global aspect, but so many businesses, you can't push firefighters to the globe, things that we're urgent need of. You can't push your warehouse workers to the globe because they have to be local. They're loading up things. And so you look at these industries in demand and they can't really push this work out. And then you think, well, they've already consumed all of their local labor force. So you're left with immigrants. In the past year, that the only reason our labor force grew was because of foreign-born workers. Things have changed. And there are no other options except for automation. So this presents the most interesting part of all. And it's funny, as I just pulled this research this morning for the paper we're writing. If you look at last year in 2023, the largest consumer of robotics in the US were the auto industry and electronics, so semiconductors. Those were the largest consuming industries of robotics for the past decade or two.
Yeah.
Nothing's changed. It's not going into your fast food restaurant. A lot of people are like, well, they have kiosks. It's like these stores are still employing a tremendous amount of these non-degree jobs. When you talk about AI and what they're saying right now they're looking to replace, it's none of the jobs that we're having these crises filling. It's hard to imagine, knowing what I know about the World Wide Web, which was supposed to get rid of all brick and mortar retail. It didn't. It just created Amazon and a ton of other companies that now employ all of our workers. And now you bring it forward to here. Did robotics get rid of the auto industry or the semiconductor industry? No. In fact, those industries, especially semiconductors, is short, I think, 70,000 workers right now. Is AI going to displace people? Yeah. And then it's going to need a ton of people to come to use all the new things that it's going to create. We're at that cusp of innovation where people are still in the fear stage. That's been true since the personal computer in 71. Now it's time to change. We've got to start to get this thing and understand, how are we going to utilize these things? If you look at every technology going back through history, they always create way more than they destroy.
One paper that came out in all of this hype was the National Bureau of Economic Research a couple of weeks ago had an article out that in this particular economist point of view is only 20% of the existing tasks in the United States with the current AI tools and their trajectory can actually be replaced. And of that 20%, only 27% of that can be done profitably. So it still seems like there is a long way to go, perhaps even decades, where material job disruption occurs. And to your point, e-commerce came along and the U.S. Postal Service had a whole commission researching and thinking that this was going to destroy the U.S. Postal Service. In fact, e-commerce made Amazon, UPS, FedEx, huge organizations.
I always get disappointed at humanity's ability to insult itself. We have a tendency to look at things and go, we're just going to sit back and let ourselves be destroyed by technology. That's never, ever, ever happened from the time we invented fire or the wheel. It's only propelled us to the next thing. Nothing ever subtracts. In the long run, it always adds. What I am bothered by is there was a study that was done. They're talking about jobs that could be augmented by AI. And in the bottom 10% was nurses, registered nurses. You just think about what is by far the biggest need in this country. It's not even close. If you look at job postings in our LightCast data, the biggest job by far is registered nurses. And we're going all over the globe to try to find these people. It's a single point of failure in these hospitals. They have so many tasks that they need to do. And you look at things like robotics or AI, and it can't do those things that this person's doing. When they've studied what nurses do, they were like, it's like 8% of it maybe could be affected by automation. You're already waiting in the waiting rooms of hospitals for hours on end. Well, this is not the hurricane. These are the outer bands. What's coming is so much stronger than this. Well, what are you going to do then? And I think we could use AI to maybe triage people so that they're not having to be seen by these people. Maybe the AI could help them to go to another facility. That would be a great use of it.
So my organization that I work at, Turing, we hosted Sam Altman at one of our events recently. He talked about this actually very specific in healthcare and where AI is. And the conundrum that they're facing today is how many times better will AI have to be at diagnosing patients before people trust it? The challenge is he feels it has to probably be up to 100 times better than a nurse or a doctor today for people to trust it. So there's a long way to go. And I again, appreciated his pragmatic point of view.
There's an example of this that we can already look at. In my prior job, we worked with one of the automakers to help them price these people who are going to come along and work in these cars that are going to be self-driving cars. Now, this was back in around 2010, the late 2000s. And at that time, it was all going to be self-driving cars. By 2020, 2030, it's all self-driving cars. Well, turns out that when a self-driving car runs over someone, then the whole industry just disappears and no one really even talks about it much anymore. And that's what happened is there's so much nuance when it comes to driving. I made a post on LinkedIn, and people will forgive human error because they're so used to it. But if your technology injures them, they're going to sue you through the floor. 2 or 3 of those things, and you're out of business. And this is exactly, he nailed it. It doesn't have to be as good. It needs to be 1,000 times better, because if it makes a mistake, I'm going to sue you. Or not me, but society's going to make you pay for your lousy implementation of technology. So that is absolutely correct.
Yeah, it's a tough conundrum to work through. And we've covered a lot of ground. Heading in here to the final few minutes, what are some practical things that you feel HR and talent leaders should be looking at and starting to prepare for?
Learning how to do work with less people is critical. We've been talking about productivity since the 70s, and it's always been about productivity, increasing productivity. There's a different aspect of this now. Before it was like you were going to improve your cost if you can be more productive. Now we're like, how are you going to get work done? And I think that this is requiring some industries to fundamentally change. One of the companies I've met with in the past couple of years, it was in fast food. And I was like, you're fast food. You don't need a restaurant. Like, why not just do drive-through? And I think that's just a very small way of thinking. We got to rethink how we consume labors. In this country, there's a tremendous amount of need for that kind of non-college degreed worker, and a very big misunderstanding that we seem to have a lot of them out there, but where there's less than around 2 million of them unemployed right now looking for work for 4.5 million job openings. And this is going to get worse. So I think understanding what you have to work with as a society, recognizing and rewarding people, no matter who they are. We were almost taught for several decades to look down on certain jobs and certain people. Now it's going to switch the opposite. For HR people, I would say it's a matter of no sloppy attrition, no sitting there and just going, it's okay, we're going to replace my. You should have learned your lesson in 21 and 22. A big part of that is when we look at surveys of Gen Zs, they all talk about, I want a job that I know at the end of the day, I did something valuable. More than making money, I want to know that what I did was important. And HR people are going to have to do a really good job of investing in people, mentoring them, saying, here's what we see you doing, and this is going to be really valuable. We do a great service for society. So the message for HR has to be, how can we, instead of just sitting there interviewing people and dumping on them, do you do this? Do you have this and everything? How do you start to impart the mission and purpose of your company with passion and heart? Tech companies are phenomenal at that. Like when they call people up, they'll rip people out of a big organization to another one because they're like, we're doing this now, and you're going to want to be a part of that. We all have to learn those lessons.
Yeah.
Everybody, no matter what industry you're in, you've got to understand what it is about your company that's valuable, and you've got to pass that into the people that you're interviewing.
I completely agree. And final question for you, which comes back to immigration. There's a lot of contentious views around a very complex topic. One question that I love that you mentioned for folks is, who's going to do the work? So no matter what your view is, we still have to solve the problem. What are some other maybe thought-provoking questions that you would like people to consider, no matter what their view is on immigration?
Our curiosity around data. People are very quick to accept narratives. You would think over the past several years, a lot of social media things misled us. And I think everybody got to a point where they say, well, I don't know if I trust what the media is saying. Go look, research this stuff, get familiar with the sites themselves. I taught my kids when they were growing up, don't believe anything that you hear, even if I say it. Like, always go out and investigate it for yourself. I call it lazy narratives. When I hear you just parroting something that somebody else said versus going, the data says the exact opposite. We're in an election year, so you're going to hear a lot of very twisted information, sometimes outright lies. Don't be another person who just passes on information without checking. Look for the truth. And if you're wondering where those things are, educate yourself on what sites produce this kind of data, understand why they're making that data, and you'll do yourself a lot of favors. If you're in HR, you have a responsibility to know that you're looking at actual factual data versus just passing on something that's not.
It's really easy to decide what to put on a protest sign, the slogan you want. It's much harder to solve the problem. Yeah. So be open to the complexities of solving an issue. Right. When it comes to data, I always recommend folks take basic data courses to at least understand. In HR, I've often seen where HR leaders come, we lowered our turnover rate by 1%. You're like, well, one, that doesn't tell the whole story. And two, that's still within one deviation. So it's not really a material move. But to end us out here, and people want to connect with you, what is the best way to do that?
If you go on LinkedIn, you're going to be looking for Ron L, as in Larry Hetrick. It's all going to be kind of joined together. If you just do a search of Ron Hetrick, you'll see me. I'm wearing glasses in a picture. I put up everything that kind of clicks into my brain that I feel is interesting, or if I hear a narrative going on that I see maybe on YouTube or I see people talking about in social media, a lot of times I'll weigh in with the actual data so that people can actually see what's going on versus what they're being told. I really feel that it's important for people to know the truth. And if I'm the one who can find it, then I'm going to help you at least understand it. But that's definitely the best way.
The insights of macroeconomic trends shaping our labor market are truly eye-opening. From the mass retirement of baby boomers to the critical role of immigration in our future workforce growth, it's clear that we all have our work cut out for us. But how is this actively impacting us in executive placement and hiring? Are these trends playing out in the real world of HR and job seeking? Well, that's the question that we're going to be asking Erica White in this part of this segment. She is the Executive Director in HR Search and Recruitment at Fraser Jones, and she's going to offer us some interesting insights that she's been seeing at the executive HR level in the past year.
Within HR, at least, where I specialize in making placement, mainly at the management to exec level, there has been a slowdown in terms of movement as things start to pick up. Things are looking positive. At the same time, we're not experiencing what we saw, of course, in 2021, early 2022. That was a complete anomaly. That was never going to be a condition that was going to stay for the long term. In terms of the return to office piece that you mentioned, that is still something that HR leaders are struggling with. And whenever I speak with HR leaders who are looking to hire or are also considering a move themselves and are in charge of the return to office mandate, it is still a point of contention. It really depends on the industry. you're seeing in financial and professional services industries, companies are usually having people in 3 to 5 days a week. I would say other industries, it's a bit more flexible potentially. What we're experiencing on the recruiting side is, of course, not just discussing what people's career aspirations are. Lifestyle has become a very big part of how they're looking at, our job seekers are looking at their careers and looking at it pretty holistically, not just climbing that ladder and what's next.
You are seeing some positive outlook on hiring and placement, which is good. Is that effect spiky? And what I mean by that is anecdotally, I've had several friends get laid off. Those that are in the business partner realm have seemed to get quick jobs. Those in talent acquisition and other niche areas of HR have been unemployed for quite some time. Are you seeing the same trends?
What's interesting because you can talk to one job seeker and they're flooded with interviews and opportunities, and you can talk to another in a very similar role and they may say it's completely quiet. There may be some trends here and there depending on the role. Luckily, to your point, we are seeing more talent acquisition roles opening up, which is a really good sign for, I think, everyone. It's really dependent, though, to go back to the lifestyle and holistic piece. We're not just looking now and screening people and meeting people and discussing what career trajectory looks like, but also what are their lifestyle factors? How are they motivated? What's that balance that they're looking for? What are the priorities in their life? While COVID was quite disruptive, it did also bring us into a new era of work where people are highly considering their mental health and well-being and family and other priorities as it relates to how work and life really integrate.
Two things that I've recognized over the decade of having been in HR is high quality talent always has options. And so that's a call to have great retention efforts within an organization. But what's interesting is on that upper quartile of wage earners, they tend to have the flexibility and the desire to balance that work life, to really emphasize, am I going to accept this next role? Is it going to have that level of flexibility? During the pandemic, we saw a lot of changes in what companies were offering when it came to flexible work arrangements. People were fully remote. Some of that's shifted, but what are 2 or 3 things that have remained consistent that candidates are asking for from organizations prior to accepting roles?
I think that's also a pretty relative question. You have people who are very flexible. It really depends on how badly they want to leave their current job, or if they're not employed, how badly they want a job. We're still seeing, though, and also I think it depends on the role too. There's certain positions or certain levels, depending on where they're at in their life, that they're going to want certain benefits. Those who are potentially family planning, they're looking at parental leave or fertility benefits. The flexibility piece being on site versus remote or hybrid. I will say this, we're definitely seeing junior talent looking to be in person. A lot of junior talent they don't have an interest in being remote. They recognize the value of being social, being able to network, being able to advance your career in an office setting. So that's an interesting piece. But then, of course, you have people who are later in their career who really appreciate the flexibility. So I think you'll find that it really just depends on the person and their life stage and their priorities. And then compensation, what we saw in 2021, early 2022, there was offers that were getting thrown around that were pretty significant increases for people. The belt has definitely tightened a bit. It was interesting because in 2023, you had a mismatch of talent looking for those inflated offers they were seeing in 21 and 22. And companies weren't willing to do that.
So for those individuals that took those elevated compensations in the heat of the moment, you're probably coaching, you should probably stay in your role right now.
I've talked to many who have made that move at that time, and people recognize that was a really one-time only situation, and that's not reality. It took, I think, a good 6 months to a year for the market to catch up, though. The employers have had the power for a while now. We're in a place now where there are opportunities out there, but it is still very competitive.
To pivot slightly, so we've talked about what the employees or prospective candidates are looking for. What are organizations looking for in HR executive leadership now that's either evolved since the pandemic or is just a demand no matter what age we're in?
It's a really good question. I actually wrote a blog on this on the TroopHR blog. Given the market we're in, I think that hiring managers are being quite picky and choosy. And so what that means for HR execs is needing relevant industry experience. That's become a big focal point, where maybe in the past it's been a bit more loose. Obviously, it's important for HR leaders to be able to come in and understand the population that they're serving, their unique needs, whether it's a tech and sales heavy population or not, and a different type of population. That's something that's been very important. Also, people who are very data-driven, results-oriented, people who could speak to numbers and impact. Big focus on ROI, so understanding how HR leaders and how they can explain and showcase some of the work they've done where they've actually saved the company money or have been a profit center versus a cost center, and being able to tell that story is something that is becoming more and more important. The philosophy needs to be a match. You have companies that are looking for your typical HR operational leaders, where it may just be more about payroll, benefits, policies, procedures, and whatnot. And then you have your more strategic HR leaders and companies that would welcome that.
To bring up ROI, is there one in particular that stands out as something that provides the most ROI for your candidates in interview process?
There's been so many people I've talked to have been doing Workday implementations, a lot of systems upgrades and whatnot. So there's been definitely a big focus on systems and how that's been able to make the company more efficient and hopefully more profitable. Also looking at talent acquisition and the numbers around efficiency with that, and also the retention numbers as well, and how some of their programming has led to retention efforts. So there's a lot of different areas that you can look at when it comes to how an HR leader has proven high ROI.
I have 2 Workday mugs, so for everyone that has gone through that process, they know you get the mug, right?
Yeah.
But the going into an interviewing process is daunting, even for HR professionals. I feel like even more so for HR professionals. Prior to getting those interviews started, what's some coaching that you would have for HR executives?
A lot of it has to do with just being super prepared while still being very genuine and authentic to yourself. That's the only way you're going to figure out if this is the right fit or not, especially at the leadership level. There's a lot of opinions, and I think it's imperative to be able to find leadership that's going to support your beliefs and the way that you feel HR should be supported. I think it's always best to be able to bring to life your experience. So it's the show me, don't tell me model of coming up with really strong examples of how you've been successful, and also strong examples of how you've not been successful and where you failed and how you've taken responsibility and been able to solve for that. It's not about trying to find a weakness that is also a strength. It's not really about that. It's really about being able to explain a real life example of where things can go wrong, because things do go wrong, and being able to demonstrate the grace of taking the responsibility and being able to learn from it and grow from it. I mean, asking really insightful questions, that's a big piece of this too. I think hiring managers want to understand how invested this person is and how much they actually understand of the company and the role, and being able to showcase that through asking intelligent questions is important too.
When you were talking about the weakness into a strength, that always reminds me of the Office episode where Michael Scott does that thing question, and it's, I care too much, I try too hard.
Yeah.
We're
past that now. Everyone knows that's an old trick. It's not genuine. And I think people really, at this point, everyone's gone through something in the last bunch of years. I think we've all become a lot more human. I'm not saying let your guard down in an interview. Definitely don't do that. But I think at the same time, it's about being real. It's about being authentic.
Depending on which sector someone's working in, it could be quite a small community. So what advice do you have to executives as they decide to move on without burning a bridge?
Yeah, it depends on the situation, but being able to lead gracefully would mean to be able to be a resource up until a point of which they need you, until obviously within reason. Giving a proper notice is important. I know people have contracts that have all sorts of notice periods in them, anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months, and potentially more for some of the larger financial services firms. It's important to, I think, be able to explain why in a way that, of course, is not going to offend anyone. Also talk more about running towards something versus away from something. Similar to what you would call an approach goal versus an avoidance goal. Look, I've always been looking forward and wanting to do X, Y, Z. I was given this opportunity that I couldn't refuse or say no to. This has been an amazing time at XYZ firm. And now it's time for me to take the next step. So I think it's usually about speaking to what's next versus what went wrong.
I love the eloquent answer you gave of running to something and not away from.
Yeah.
Great call out for our listeners. To enter somewhat of a rapid fire question setting now as we close out here in a few, what is the benefit for a listener that's deciding, should I go through a search firm to find my next role or go by myself and try my luck at LinkedIn?
My obvious answer is you should use a search firm, but I'm just trying to sell myself, I guess. No, but really, what I always recommend when you're starting a search process is take a diversified approach. So you could work with, you have like your cold, warm, and hot. Like if you're thinking about this from like a sales perspective or a funnel, you have cold, which is LinkedIn. So the chances of you hearing back from an application or reaching out cold on LinkedIn to someone completely random, the chances are not terribly high, but of course you could get that one or two people that respond and it works out. And people do get jobs from applications on LinkedIn or from cold outreaches. It's not a high percentage. But look, if you see something you like or someone you want to connect with, go for it. And then you have your warm contacts, which could potentially be a recruiter search. You start to work with an search firm or recruitment firm. You make a good impression with the recruiters there. They're going to want to advocate for you. And I can only speak for myself, but in terms of how I approach the market and how I approach this job, it's very much a long-term relationships focused role for me. I work with people and place people 2 or 3 times in their career or more. I've been in touch with some people since I've started this career 11 years ago. So it's very much a relationships focused business in my mind and all about connecting the dots and making the right matches. For me, I have a lot of industry intel, a lot of confidential information I'm hearing day in and day out of where there's movement. So I'm able to really be able to connect the dots, especially being very niche within the financial and professional services space. So it's a huge benefit to work with a specialized recruiter like myself. We know the industry, we know the players, we know where there's movement. We're able to make proactive introductions and also very targeted introductions, obviously, of course, for specific search that we're working on. And then we have your hot people, which are your family and friends and people that can easily get you in the door. Very much recommend working with a search firm. At the same time, I would not discount taking a very diversified approach to search.
For my own anecdotes working with a search firm, one, you have that intelligence, that person that's going to be advocating for you. They usually will not waste your time because they understand what comp expectations and what benefits you're looking for. And then, of course, most of the time, they're pretty in tune to what a company's looking for. And they know off the bat, not going to be a match. They're not going to waste either party's time. So I've always found that to be helpful to help.
We're matchmakers. I mean, talent matchmakers, it's a really fun job. It's one where I very much see this as a partnership across all parties. And it's a very unique job to be in because if someone gets placed, everyone wins.
Yeah. So on an executive resume, when you get them from respected candidates, what's a pet peeve that HR folks they need to fix?
I tend to see this actually the most on executive resumes, more so than you'd see on a more junior mid-level resume. But the summary section or the objective section at the top that can be lengthy. Unless you're making a career pivot, I would say those are usually fairly unnecessary. The other thing to watch out for, to be honest, is if you're going for a specific job and you have a very standard objective or statement at the top, there have been times I've seen candidates get pulled out of process because of some of the things that they've said in those summaries. Be selective with where you're putting those or where you're sending those.
The areas that I've seen too, if you're going to put something that is the specialty of another executive on the interview panel, be prepared to back that up, right? You're putting revenue forecasting or something along those lines.
Right.
I would blame you. And question, which I think will be the easiest here. What is the best way for people to get in touch with you?
The best way to get in touch with me, I'm of course on LinkedIn. Also, you can reach out to me over email. My email is Erica White, WHITE @FrazierJones.com. Those would probably be the best two areas to get in touch with me at this point.
Erica's perspective on the current HR job market is invaluable. It's fascinating to see the broader trends that Ron discussed manifesting themselves in real-world hiring practices and job seeker expectations. Now let's drill down even further into one of the most critical aspects of HR, compensation. Joining us in this segment is Rani Mavram, an expert in compensation strategies. With all of these changes in the labor market and hiring practices, I'm eager to see how companies are adapting their compensation philosophies and tactical approaches to address the macro-level changes happening just before our eyes.
We're starting to see two things. The first is companies needing to think more about this keyword that keeps coming up, repeatability. Folks learned the hard way in 2020 and 2021 that if they were going to pay very competitive wages, that they were going to set expectations with employees. And I see you smiling because I'm sure you've been a part of some of these conversations too. We're seeing the same thing with a lot of the roles that you just described. And these job profiles are one that most folks think will converge over time. Software engineering, ML engineering, AI engineering, and actually build more pricing around what are the competencies that these roles have. Are we making decisions today that we would stand by confidently if we were to make the same decision next year and for the next 5 to 10 years over again? The second one, which I led with, was how do we think about what is going to be most important for our teams, right? We're seeing a lot more honest discussion around, can we continue to be remote? What is the financial impact of the business? Is there value in having some type of hybrid opportunity? And I bring that up because there's quite a bit of research that suggests that folks that are in office versus remote have different pay expectations. So if companies are now going to be taking an approach of having folks return back to the office, are they ready to have the conversation around how pay might change and how much additional investment they need to make in their employees as a result of this strategy shift?
What stood out to me is something that I just heard a lot about from last week. So I had the privilege of attending CNBC CEO Summit in DC, representing our CHRO Council. And one feedback I heard in particular around AI is you had a lot of non-tech companies that were building teams from scratch. And then they were quickly finding out that they would lose those engineers 5-6 months later because they would go work at AI-centric companies that would just pay them significantly more. So it sounds like you have some clients that are facing some of these tough decisions. How are you helping them to compete in a sustainable way versus one that they can't?
It's a topic that doesn't get discussed, right? Most folks, when they think about compensation, they think about market data. We need to hire a few software engineers. Here's the market. Here's the seniority and skill set we're looking for. Great. Let's figure out how much market's paying. The tough part is actually what happens after that, which is Taylor looks at the benchmarks. We can't quite pay $250,000 for this role. What are we going to do about it? And so I think that takes us back to the question that you answered, which is what are the levers around compensation? And I think we're seeing a lot of our customers and also in market more generally start to be more creative around STI, short-term incentives, long-term incentives. And the third, which I don't think is quite formulated into an incentive today, is transparency. Starting with short-term incentives, obviously with salary being a primary decision criteria, companies offering more sign-on bonuses or some type of fixed target in cases where the company has goals to hit. From a long-term incentive perspective, we're actually seeing a lot more on the equity side. So more creative vesting schedules, employer-friendly early exercise options, or even companies undergoing much earlier in their process the decision to have even longer exercise windows. So they're starting to find new corners of this equation to start to use to their advantage. The last prong of this, which I just alluded to, is transparency, which is it's great for companies to have longer exercise windows, different vesting schedules. maybe even front-loaded vests where them staying at the company for a shorter period of time means they get more equity. None of that lands if the candidate or the employee don't understand it, right? So from an operational perspective, we're seeing a lot of teams internalize the fact that they have to have this education with every single candidate, every single executive, every single manager to ensure that the hard work that they're putting into their comp philosophy is now actually being realized at the moments where it matters.
What I've noticed in the marketplace over the past 2 years is many folks have now become much more aware of the potential upside, but also the potential risk of equity compensation. You've seen so many tech companies primarily have their valuations crushed in the marketplace. They still have not recovered. And so those folks that have been given those huge equity grants at these lofty valuations have been wiped out. When it comes to having a more educated or fluent workforce in equity, what have you specifically been guiding your clients to do when it comes to explaining their valuations or assigning equity to new hires?
Some of these best practices, Taylor, ones that are not new, but probably just worth repeating. One underlying theme when it comes to compensation is expectation setting. If you've talked to any CEO that's taken a company public, they will tell you that they went through a down round at some point in their process from founding to actual IPO or exit. So it's not uncommon. And the reason why I think it's important to drill that in is because if it's not uncommon, then why are folks struggling to understand it? And I think a lot of that comes down to in the moments where we're talking about valuations, valuation today, but also valuation targets in the future, what expectations are we setting? And I think that is often the culprit. It's folks that are starting with a high valuation, saying we're going to get to 3x, 5x, or 10x this multiple with sometimes minimal awareness as to which business metrics most inform our valuation. What is the time frame by which we hope to achieve these valuations? What are the strategic business decisions we're going to need to make from a product perspective, from a people perspective, to get to those milestones? And so something that we give a lot of our customers very specific guidance around is start from a first principles approach around what milestones and metrics are important to the business, and then show the journey to the valuation. So that's never a surprise when the company unfortunately does need to take a down round, but rather more grounding in that here are the metrics or milestones we now need to anchor to. The second piece that I feel very compelled to just quickly mention, considering my former comp consulting days too, is that when we think about down rounds, there are a couple of different inputs as we think about equity. And this doesn't have to do with down rounds in specific, but this can do with everything from the financial efficiency of the business to the runway. Are we targeting an IPO or an exit or some other outcome? I always recommend that candidates and employees ask these tough questions, even as early as the interview process of, hey, are we in this for an IPO? And if we are, equity is intended to be something that stays with you for 4 to many years with you, right? So think about this momentary period of time and then fixate on what's the next thing that we need to do to get to that longer term outcome that we had established at the very beginning.
The highlight when you're at specifically those early stages, be mindful of how much equity you're giving away too. I feel like that's something that maybe is undervalued in that stage. Yeah. You brought up another great part of this conversation is many of our listeners may be going after a new executive job in the next year or two. What are those 2 or 3 specific questions that they should ask as part of their due diligence into a future employer?
Yeah. I'm going to quote Heather, who leads the people team at Brex, and we had a really fun opportunity to spend some time with her a few weeks ago. People leaders and executives, any other form of business leaders, I would start by having a very honest conversation around what has the past financial and business impact of the company been, and what does it look like moving forward? But really getting granular around what were misses in the past and how did the team learn from them in order to inform, do you have the right skill set to help this company in their next stage of growth? So that'd be one question. Let's unpack the past. really understand the future, and then build conviction in the future outcomes. The second area I'd say is really have a great working relationship with the executives you're working with. It's often hard to build that trust through the interview process, but if you can, I would try to bring up cases in your own career where you needed to have that support from the executive team and walk through where you could have felt more supported. And then also ask for precedent of this, right? Are there examples in the past where, you've made potentially a tough decision that, the people leaders or executives you've worked with still stand by despite how difficult the recourse might have been? And then the third I'd say is what does the team feel not well equipped to do today? I would use that as a moment to confirm that your expectations of the job are in line with theirs. And I think sometimes it's just the mismatch. Again, it comes back to expectation setting, but sometimes it's the mismatch, at least at the executive level, that can be really distracting even.
Fantastic framework. The other side of that is businesses that are bringing in new executives or any role. One thing that you mentioned towards the beginning of the call, there's a wide distribution of market data out there. And you as an executive, if you came to me and asked for benchmarking roles, I can go benchmark the role to say whatever you would like. But I feel like what companies have learned in a higher for longer interest rate environment is that they need to do things that are more sustainable. So it's not just picking the $250,000 benchmark because that's what sounds good. I do think there has to be a candid discussion among the founders or the executive leadership team of what are our real comparables out there, both in financials, opportunity for growth, type of talent we're going after. Because without that guiding principle, I feel like you're going to get lost in a sea of unsustainable practices. Now, I'd love to hear, how do you help framing that up either with your own team or with the clients that you support to have that candid discussion?
Again, this is a great question because it's coming up more so, I'd say, in this market where we're seeing 20, 25 person companies with multi-billion-dollar valuations, right? Or on the trajectory for it. So we're talking about very different peer groups from a market data standpoint. And a lot of it comes down to who do these companies want to compete with? That's it. It's as simple as that. And so that is the first principle. The second, which we talked about even prior in this conversation, is what can you actually do? Because let's say you do want to compete based on your valuation and build a peer group based off of that. Most companies don't have the luxury of just following what the data says. Right? And so I'd recommend building a few anchor points to your philosophy. One might be, here's a percentile that we're going to peg ourselves to from a cash standpoint. And maybe give ourselves some flexibility on the equity standpoint. Another form of this is what type of incentive structure do we want to have with employees? We'll ask our customers, do you intend to have some type of annual bonus? At what point do you think that would make sense? Do you already have one in place? And really fixate on what they're trying to accomplish from those programs. Is it incentivized performance? Is it to help move folks up their career ladder and incentivize progression? But each of these sub-questions really is in service of who do you want to compete with? And then obviously, who do you want to retain? So I wouldn't miss the operative question of once you close great talent, how do you keep them around? And I think a lot of the retention aspect comes down to, do you have the right long-term incentives in place?
I'm glad you brought up the retention aspect too. One area that I've seen the HR community historically not do well at is giving the adjustments when they're needed. And you end up having your new hires that know less about the business making significantly more than those that have all that intellectual property in their head. What are some best practices you've seen with clients on how they make sure that they reward loyalty instead of punishing it?
The loyalty aspect maybe doesn't come up in that exact format of loyalty, but rather in continued performance, I'd say. And I think a few places where I've seen great examples of this is to allow more fluidity when it comes to performance. For a long time, especially in the Bay Area and tech more generally, there's always been this fixation around if you're currently performing as an L3, you're gunning the next promo to L4, and here's the scope and responsibilities associated with that. We're seeing more companies be accepting of less of that, which is, I want to be an L3 right now. I don't have the capacity to quite step up to an L4. And we're happy to keep you at the company as an L3 until you're ready to make that transition. More recently, we've been seeing more examples of folks that are actually open to downward progression, which is, I had some familial commitments come up. I want to stay at the company. I still believe in what we're building. I might need to step into this L2 scope for a period of time, all with the intention of longer term being able to step back up. By the way, when I say L2 scope, folks are rarely quoting leveling structures, even though I think I would find that particularly entertaining. But I think you get what I'm saying. They're building a little bit more bidirectionality to progression within the company that allows them to have loyal employees stay instead of requiring them to find other opportunities.
I've loved that. I've seen that too. Part of the advice that I've given to leaders is growth isn't always upward, right? It can be deeper in a category.
Totally. Yeah.
And I've seen an interesting trend of more managers becoming ICs than I have ever had. And maybe that's like the post-pandemic blues catching up with managers. But we've seen a lot of that mobility. Since you have taken over as CEO, founder of this organization that you're at, what is one thing that has surprised you that you didn't expect when you started when it comes to compensation?
I have been surprised by how many companies have achieved such great product and business success, but feel and lack confidence when it comes to where they go from there, from a retention standpoint, and really feeling like they're on their back foot when it comes to continuing to capture top talent and retaining the folks that they already have. And I don't even mean this at a more junior manager level. I'm talking about CTOs, chief people and product officers, head of sales, asking these really tough questions of, I'm not sure where we're heading from here from a comp standpoint. And I might even need a refresher on what our options are.
That is more pertinent now than ever. Another call out that I would have to organizations that, if they're public, have seen their valuations drop is if you are bullish on the future of your company, then when a stock price is artificially or depressed for whatever reason, that's the time to get in. That's where you could see meaningful upside. I know we can't promise, the SEC's listening, any particular outcome with a stock. But to me, the time to join the company wasn't when it's not at its peak of stock valuation. You tend to get more appreciation by taking a little bit of measured risk in your career. 2 final questions for you. What is one bit of advice you would give to someone that is negotiating their comp actively?
Understand how they made the decision around your comp. Do they have ranges? Do they have a comp philosophy? How often do they revisit their comp philosophy? And I'm happy to plug one of our resources here. It's called the handbook.complete.so with 30 plus questions to ask your future employer, specifically at startups.
And
Can you tell how much easier the answer to that question came than some of the others?
That's why you're the CEO. And for the listeners, we will add that link into our description so that you can find that resource. Final question, how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is the best spot to connect. It's just my first name, Rani, and my last name, Mavram, Mavram. Shoot me a note if you have follow-up questions from anything that we talked about today. I'd love to hear from you all.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the TroopHR podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to subscribe and leave a 5-star rating. If you would like to learn more about our community, please visit TroopHR.com. In the meantime, keep living the dream.